Today I'm here with my dear friend, Dr. Glisette Colon, and she's going to share some very interesting information with you. In particular, I've asked her to begin with telling us a little bit about herself, a little autobiographical sketch. Glisette?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Dr. Glisette Colon, and I'm an assistant professor in the Exceptional Education Department here at Buffalo State. I also have the pleasure of being the coordinator for the Bilingual Certificate Program, where I work with Spanish-speaking teacher candidates to obtain their bilingual extension. I'm a Bengal girl all the way, Buffalo born and raised, but I have lived my entire life moving back and forth between Buffalo and Puerto Rico. I started school as a fluent Spanish speaker, believe it or not, with my accent. I did not know any English when I entered school. I received ENL services, and I also had the pleasure of attending one of our local bilingual schools. And so I speak both languages, and I'm so excited to be here with you to speak about my experiences as a multilingual learner and how you all can teach this wonderful student population.
Thank you so much. One of the reasons that I believe teaching students whose primary language is other than English is such a challenge for us is because we don't have the context. We don't understand the laws, the regulations, everything that students and teachers of those students have to go through and need to know to be able to teach them thoroughly and properly and with love. So Dr. Colon is going to share with us some interesting data on the ENL population.
Great. So the first question is, who are our ENL students or our English language learners? So the first thing that happens when any child enters school, whether it be kindergarten for the first time or they've arrived from out of the state, for example, or in many cases out of the country, the families have to complete a registration packet. And part of that packet includes a home language questionnaire. And in that language questionnaire, there are some questions that ask whether the child interacts with another language in the 4 domains of language. So do they speak another language, read another language, listen to another language, write another language, for example. And if at any point the parents mark off yes, then an informal interview is conducted. And for those of you who work within the Buffalo Public Schools, that is all done by the Language Assessment Center. But if you work outside of the district in the smaller suburban districts, it's typically the ENL teacher that would do this. So you can see here on your slide, there's kind of a flow map of the progress, or the process, I should say. So after the informal interview, if it's determined that the child indeed does either listen, speak, read, or write this other language, then formal testing is done. And the initial assessment is referred to as the NICETEL. That's the New York State Initial Test of English Language Learning. So welcome to all of the acronyms here in education. And depending on where the child scores on this test, they are then placed in an ENL either classroom or receive some type of service, and it could be either bilingual programming. If in the case of Buffalo or New York City, we do offer bilingual programming in both Spanish and Chinese. But for the most part, they're placed in any type of classroom, and they're going to receive ENL services. And if you click on the link here on the slide where it says program placement, you're going to see the mandatory units of study or minutes of instruction that the child has to receive according to New York State's Commissioner Regulation Part 154. So I would highly recommend that you take some time to look at that form and become familiar with this regulation, because the likelihood of you working with an English language learner is going to be quite high. Buffalo in Western New York is a refugee resettlement city, and so that's going to increase the odds. And if you do have one or more of these students in your classroom, then you want to become familiar with Part 154. And then after each year after that, they are annually assessed using the NICESLAT, which is the New York State English as a Second Language Achievement Test. And that's just to measure their English language proficiency each year until eventually they test out. And what happens is, on the next slide here, you'll see that there are 5 levels of English language proficiency as per New York State. And those are entering, emerging, transitioning, expanding, and then eventually commanding when they've reached that level of English proficiency. And it's really important as future social studies teachers that when you receive your new roster at the beginning of the year and you see that one of your students is classified as an ELL, that you find out from the ENL teacher or the Language Assessment Center what level of English language proficiency is this child performing at, so that you can plan accordingly. And we'll talk more about what that planning could look like throughout this talk. So it's also important to know here on the next slide that there's been a pretty dramatic increase in English language learners over the past decade. In fact, it has grown over 33%. And it's important to see what that makeup looks like here in New York State and at the local level. So Buffalo, New York, and the Western New York area actually ranks 3rd and 4th when we're looking at Buffalo and Rochester as having the highest percentage of ELLs in their total public school enrollment. And at the local level, it's really interesting to see how that demographic is distributed. Buffalo City Schools still remains at number 1 as the highest district in Western New York that provides services to English language learners. But if you look at this top 10 list, you'll be surprised perhaps to see that suburban districts such as Williamsville, Kenton, Sweet Home, and Amherst even actually have a high number of English language learners. So what does this all mean to you as future social studies teachers? We have to understand the challenges that these students face in your schools, and it's important to understand that they have a double cognitive load, if you will, because they have to learn the content that you're teaching in their classrooms while simultaneously acquiring English language instruction. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, myself and Ms. Lupo.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I've realized over the years is that many of my social studies education students have very little experience with students or even friends that they've met in their own schooling who are emergent English language learners. So you can be a little intimidated when you go out into your classrooms and you're all excited because you're the new global studies teacher. And then you are faced with a classroom where it could be as high as a half or 2/3 of your students are not native English language speakers. And there you are presented with a hugely overwhelming curriculum. And I'm picking on global because it is very overwhelming and it's a 2-year course of study. And you realize, well, my gosh, I have 7 different language groups in this class. How am I ever going to teach them? So it can be very daunting. You need to remember that you're never alone. You will have an ESL teacher who will work with your students. You'll have school social workers. You'll have guidance counselors. And most of all, you'll have their families. So I want to encourage you never to think of yourself as an individual up against these insurmountable odds. You always have a team there to support you. And in fact, you'll get the very best results as a teacher of a content-drenched area like social studies if you reach out to all of these folks and you provide a really safe network for your kids to begin learning the content. When I began as a secondary social studies teacher, of course, that wasn't who I thought I was. I thought I was walking into a school to teach a brand new group of 7th and 8th graders, and that content area, as you know, is U.S. history and government with an emphasis on social history. And to my surprise, I discovered that I was in a bilingual setting, which in those days meant some classes were monolingual Spanish speaking only, some classes were monolingual English speaking only, and in the middle you had kind of a hodgepodge. I would say perhaps 10% of those children in the bilingual school were true bilinguals. So to put it to you mildly, I was overwhelmed. I was also immediately informed by my principal if I wanted to keep the job, which I did because I'd worked hard to get it, I would have to go and get my bilingual certification. Well, I had gotten my bachelor's degree, I had gotten my master's degree, and now I'm told that's not good enough. If you want to keep this job, if you want to get tenure, because we really love you and want to keep you here, you may only stay here if you get bilingual certification. I loved the children, I loved my colleagues, and I was just in love with the parents and learning all the cultural things I could possibly soak up. So, took myself up to UB, got enrolled in the bilingual 7 through 12 extension program. It was the best thing I could have done for a number of reasons. Yes, I studied a lot of literature and strategies and methodologies, but most of all, I was the lone gringa in almost every single class. The very first night when I walked into a very heavy literature-based class, the professor announced that since this is a bilingual class, I'm going to teach it all in Spanish and you will all be fine. My heart sunk. My 6 years of junior high and high school Spanish had not prepared me for that. So I began by asking his permission, and I taped every single class, and I sat with a very dear friend of mine who was a native Spanish speaker, and she would work with me every single weekend. And I would say to her, I think he was saying, I think he meant, and she talked me through all of it. However, the reason why this was so significant to me was it allowed me to empathize with my kids, with my students and their parents. Imagine coming into parent conference teacher night with a completely, you think, English speaking teacher with all of these huge textbooks and maps and globes, all in English, and you're only a Spanish speaker. So I got that feeling of how that feels to be intimidated, shy, so worried, so scared, and that was perfect. It was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. So when you find yourself in that situation, and as Dr. Colon said, I don't think you're going to be able to escape being in that situation no matter which district you find yourselves in. Just relax and enjoy it and love it. Soak it all up, and it has nothing to do with inadequacy either on the part of the students or yourself. It's just kids are kids, and you will just love every minute of it, I can assure you of that. So now I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Colon, and she's going to share with us a little bit about her thinking as you go forth as social studies teachers in terms of language and literacy.
Yeah, so as Professor Lupo was mentioning, it's really important that you dig deep into your pedagogical toolbox, if you will, to figure out how can I support these multilingual learners in our classroom. And the first thing to remember is that those effective teaching strategies that are good for all students are really what you want to make sure are at the foundation of your teaching. Things like explicit instruction, modeling, using realia and hands-on activities. Of course, I would reference the SIOP model, the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. And you don't have to know that protocol by heart, but just pull out some of the key components of it, right? So the planning of your instruction is really important. We want to make sure that our planning, our instruction, and that the assessment of our multilingual learners are all connected, right? So when we go back to our planning, are we looking at what are the English language proficiency levels of our multilingual learners? Is the way I'm delivering my content and engaging the students appropriate for where they're at linguistically when we're looking at all of the domains of language in terms of their listening skills, their speaking skills, their reading skills, and their writing skills? Are we meeting the students where they're at? So planning, I cannot overemphasize the importance of planning your instruction for your multilingual learners. And then you want to keep in mind as you teach, are you modeling the skills that you want to learn? Are you modeling the use of language? Because at the foundation of all of your instruction needs to be these purposeful acknowledgement of language. And if you will, it's the foundation. And even though they will have an ENL teacher, and an ENL teacher will either be pushing in or pulling out, it's important that you recognize that you yourself are also a language teacher and that you're always highlighting components of the English language for your students. And then, of course, the connection to assessment. When you're assessing your multilingual learners, are you assessing fairly? Does it make sense, the way in which you're assessing them, the ways in which you're evaluating them, and having them demonstrate their knowledge? Are you doing it in a way in which you're setting up your students for success in a way that they can demonstrate what they can do? Unfortunately, what we as teachers are really good at doing is assessing students in ways in which they show us what they cannot do. And when we assess English language learners using the typical assessment tools that have been designed for their monolingual peers, they will almost certainly demonstrate what these multilingual students cannot do. But we have to be creative and figure out ways that we can assess them in ways that we're able to show what they can do. The other thing I want to highlight is that as social studies teachers or future social studies teachers, you might be overwhelmed, as Professor Lupo mentioned, and think, well, how can I teach these students? I'm not an ELA teacher, I'm not an ENL teacher, and it's my job to teach content. I have to teach about the Industrial Revolution. I have to teach about World War I. How do I address language? And so the key thing that you have to think about is how can we embed literacy instruction into your lessons? So many of us think about literacy as just reading and writing, but language is at the foundation of literacy. So again, when you're thinking about your DBQ, your document-based questions, and these rich texts on historical information, how can you set up the lesson in ways that you're purposefully identifying listening to the story, reading the story, talking about the content, and writing about the content, right? So thinking about strategies such as peer-assisted learning strategies, for example. Can you partner up your students in a way that they're reading information? And it could be not necessarily grade level, but you're going to find differentiated text that meets them at where they're at, that still addresses the content that you're talking about. So you're still expecting them to meet the grade level standards, but again, you're meeting them where they're at. So if you can always think of ways in which you can embed literacy and language at the foundation of your social studies content, you'll find that your students will be much more successful.
That was great and so informative.
Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on one of the ideas that you mentioned, and that is why it's so important to take the students where they're at, not from some artificial point that we put on a lesson plan that you think they need to meet this point. One of the things that I did in my classes where I had monolingual Spanish-speaking students, which was a challenge for me, but it was great practice for me, was I allowed the students to be assessed in a variety of ways. Every time I would offer an assessment piece, whether it was embedded at the end of the week, at the end of the unit, I always made sure that it was scaffolded and multi-tiered, and that the students themselves had the ability to select the way in which they wanted to be assessed. I recall one student in particular that really brought this idea home to me. We were wrapping up a unit on the Revolutionary War and various battles. One of the options that I gave the students to demonstrate what they had learned about the Revolutionary War and its battles was they could create a poster that would show an aspect of the battles. And I outlined it for them, what it would have to contain. There was a complete rubric. This very quiet, very overaged young man who probably belonged in a sophomore class in high school, but was still in 8th grade because he simply couldn't get out. Simply couldn't get out?
Can you just start that idea over?
Yeah, he should
Start the whole thing over again.
Just start from he should have been.
Yeah, he was in 8th grade.
All right. This student probably, according to age, his chronological age, should have been a sophomore in high school. For many challenging reasons, as a learner, he found himself still in 8th grade. So I inherited this student, and it was probably his third year in 8th grade. I don't even count summer school. He loved that assignment, and he said to me, Misi, I'm going to do a poster. I said, wonderful, awesome. That boy, who didn't say a word in the regular classroom, was so shy, so introverted, got up in front of the class, lined up a series of the most beautiful posters. He had done posters in the most beautiful detail of various regiments in the Revolutionary Army on the Patriot side. Some, of course, were very ragtag. Some of them didn't even have shoes. Some had mismatched pants and shirts. But some were very spiffy, depending upon which colony they were from. He had them all. They were just beautiful. It must have taken him hours and hours, colored pencil details, and he stood up there in Spanish and described these posters, the regiments, who fought where, and he had the whole map. He had the whole map of all the battles in his head when he would say, they fought for the Massachusetts, whatever, 2nd Battalion. I was in the back of the room, and I was trying so hard not to visibly cry. And when he was finished, I wanted to run up front and grab him and hug him, but couldn't do that. The class just erupted in applause. It was one of the most wonderful presentations and projects I've ever seen. Now, ask yourselves, how would he have done on a 25-word multiple choice test with 2 essays all in English? Would I ever have any idea what he knew about the Revolutionary War? I doubt it. So it's so important to take them where they're at and let them show you. They can lead you. You don't always have to lead them.
Thank you for that example, Professor Lupo. And you bring up a really good point. Had you not assessed Hector in that way, you would have ended up with data that shows that he's performing significantly below grade level, which is what commonly happens. And so why is that an issue? Because unfortunately, even in 2019, almost 2020, there is still a disproportionate representation of multilingual learners in special education. In fact, research shows that almost half of English language learners that are struggling with reading end up classified as a student with a disability. And so let's look a little bit about what our regulations state. So immediately, if you look at the federal regulations, the definition actually states that a child may not be determined to be eligible simply because of limited English proficiency, and yet it still happens. And the main reason is because we are not instructing or assessing appropriately. So the real question is, when are special education services for English language learners appropriate? And so this is where you now have to become an investigator as a teacher of a multilingual learner. And we have to determine whether issues that are normal to second language acquisition are due to just simply a language difference, or because indeed there is a learning disability. And that often becomes quite muddy. Unfortunately, determining whether a multilingual learner has a disability is really a process of elimination. There is just simply no magic tests that by themselves can definitely tell us whether an ELL student has a disability. So it's important for teachers to, number one, understand the process of acquiring a new language. That is where collaboration with your ENL or ESL teacher comes in handy. It's also important for you as social studies teachers to understand what are the characteristics associated with disabilities, with specific learning disabilities, for example, or speech and language impairments. And this is where collaboration and consultation with your special educators becomes very important. And then looking at your own instruction, you have to ask yourself the honest question about whether or not the child has actually had adequate opportunities to learn and receive quality instruction. The challenge is that behaviors associated with learning disabilities and acquiring a second language look very similar. So English language learners, it's important to know that English language learners with learning disabilities typically exhibit the same difficulties in their home language. So that is a good way to start the investigative process, if you will, is by talking to the parents and determining if the challenges and difficulties that you're seeing in your classroom also play out at home when they're interacting with their home language. So on the following slides here, you're going to see a table that kind of compares and contrasts the behaviors associated with disability versus behaviors associated with simple language acquisition. And you'll see here that they look very similar. A child can struggle with following directions because there is a cognitive delay or a processing disorder, but they can also struggle with following directions simply because they don't understand the language. Understanding letter-sound correspondence, if you have a disability, can be a struggle. But if you speak a language that has an alphabetical system completely different than that of the English language, you're also going to see challenges with letter-sound correspondence. So how can we figure out whether or not the challenge is due to disability or simply language? So here you'll see it's not an exhaustive list, but some suggestions or recommendations for things to look like. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to compare your multilingual learners, the performance of your multilingual learners to that of their true peers. Not the peers, and not all of the peers in their classroom, but a true peer is another multilingual learner, for example, that is perhaps in the same grade and performing at a similar English language proficiency level, right? Whether it's entering or emerging, for example. And if you have a group of English language learners who are receiving ENL instruction or bilingual instruction, and several of them are moving along and progressing, certainly not at the same level of the rest of the monolingual English peers, English-speaking peers, but they are progressing. And yet, one of your English language learners seems to be still struggling and not moving along as quickly as the other English language learners, then perhaps that could be an indication that there could be a disability. Again, opportunity for use of language is important because we have to demonstrate that the limited vocabulary is still happening despite adequate opportunities for learning. So if there's adequate opportunity and there's rich language opportunities and the child is still struggling, then perhaps that can indicate that there is a disability. So we also have to look at does the child seem to be struggling with expressive or receptive language? Again, this is where a consultation with your special education teachers or speech language pathologists comes in handy because they're the experts. It's important not to confuse accent or dialect with disability. That is not a speech and language impairment. That is not a specific learning disability. And so again, as you can see here, it's really about investigating and trying to eliminate all possible variables to really determine whether or not this multilingual learner that you have is struggling because they have a learning disability.
Dr. Colon, thank you so much. This has been such a richly rewarding experience with all kinds of fabulous information that I know that we're all going to be able to use. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Gracias.
De nada.